Our panel discussion today focuses on sports science, and our moderator is Will Carroll. Will has been writing regular under the knife columns and newsletters about sports science, sports medicine, and sports for 2 decades. He is the author of The Science of Baseball, the math, technology, and data behind the Great American Pastime, and 2 other award-winning sports books, Saving the Pitcher and The Juice. He also consults with several professional teams and players on sports science. His work can be found at ESPN, Sports Illustrated, Baseball Prospectus, and the New York Times. Joining the panel are Ryan Crotin, Vice President of armcare.com, Kristen Nicholson, Assistant Professor of Orthopedic Surgery and Director of the Biomechanics and Pitching Laboratory at Wake Forest School of Medicine, and Jason Themanson, a professor in the Department of Psychology and the Neuroscience program at Illinois Wesleyan University. We will put the full bios for all of our panelists in the chat for everyone. Will, panelists, it's great to see you all today. Thanks for joining us, and feel free to take it away.
Thanks a lot, Scott. I really appreciate it, and to everybody, including the sponsors, for making this possible, and to the panelists for taking their time. Let's start with you, Dr. Nicholson. Obviously, Wake Forest has been at the forefront of research in the last 5 years in terms of science, in terms of the kind of things you're able to do. What have been the most significant advances and the new things that you're able to either see and or measure?
So I've actually only been at Wake Forest for about 3 years now. We kind of opened the lab in 2019 in January, but I think being able to use the motion capture system for player development and injury prevention is really the forefront here, because our lab is so closely tied to the Wake Forest baseball facility and team. They have access to it every single day, and so that's something that a lot of teams don't have the privilege of being able to see how they're making changes, what they're doing to stay healthy, also increase their performance.
Awesome, great stuff. Ryan, obviously what you've been doing at ArmCare has been at the forefront, and obviously we're not seeing a reduction in injuries. Do you feel that that is a failure of baseball or a failure of sports science?
I think one of the reasons why we are not seeing a reduction in injuries is that we're focused on the wrong metrics. And for what I'm saying for that is that a lot of baseball is focused on the performance side of, let's just say pitching, looking at ball flight characteristics, induced vertical break and all sorts of different motion aspects, but we're missing the concept of plate appearances and innings pitched. The focus on availability, those are the most important statistics that we need to work for. Another thing that I see in the professional realm is that there's sometimes a manpower issue, and they're missing observation windows. So my experience previously with the Angels, we had a very rigorous homestand approach to evaluating the orthopedic health of our athletes. However, most of our injuries that were occurring were happening away, where we weren't, we didn't have the technology that was portable enough, or it wasn't in the athlete's hands that we could review the data. So, I see in the foreseeable future that most teams will go to some form of portable methods to evaluate the athletes routinely. And I think that's going to make a big dent in terms of health and performance in baseball.
That's an interesting one. Let me follow up with you on that one. Yesterday, Dr. Glenn Fleissig, one of the top biomechanists ever, really, and certainly in the field today, wasn't that strong on wearable technologies, portable measures, even down to markerless motion capture. He was somewhat negative on those. Can you respond to that?
Yeah, well,
in light of your previous answer.
Yeah, it depends on the technology, for sure. When you talk about portable dynamometry, which is the company I work for, and in the field I'm in, there is pretty much consistency. devices that measure at 100 hertz are generally, highly effective to capture force data. And, looking at pre and post, let's just say fatigue elements in terms of what injuries are caused by are pretty simple to capture, and you want to be able to have that around. But when it comes to biomechanics, there are so many different ways that we are modeling athletes, how we're calculating things. The metrics that we're looking at are all different. I just read 2 papers today that had completely opposite findings as it related to knee extension and its prediction on elbow varus torque. And so the thing is you have to select a technology that, one, has been validated, has been tested. And if it's lacking validation, is it reliable? Is it repeatable? So if you have a technology that it can show changes within an individual, that can be pretty powerful, that you can make a basis in terms of something's changed. Now, most of all of these portable technologies, it has to go to a place where someone gets hands on them. If it's a range of motion restriction or a strength deficit, that has to execute some type of higher level communication and programming. And so, taking the information at face value from a particular sensor or a markerless motion capture system without diving deeper, is a problem. We have to get to the point where we're going away, I think, from certain aspects of looking at motion and focusing on strength and range of motion, because those are the aspects that influence the movement that we see. So another problem when it comes to keeping players healthy is it's very channelized. There's a sports scientist, there's a strength and conditioning, director, there's a medical director, there's a pitching director. All of these people, if they're not collaborating and ensuring that they're giving the athlete the most safe and high performance approach possible, that's also, creating our problem. It's a communication problem. And I also think we need to be as objective as possible. I'm a strength coach background. I directed it, and I had to take some of my own confirmation biases and my mental models, and I had to challenge them. And there were a lot of times where I said, what I think for an athlete to do with an athlete is wrong. And so we have to be able to be more objective. And sometimes you have to take on, a portable technology to get it done and not miss an observation window.
Great stuff. Dr. Themanson, you've obviously taken a really new tack. It's after seeing your presentation yesterday, it was something I've literally never thought of. And I love finding things like that in the terms of sports science, and especially when it involves baseball. Can you tell us a little bit, just for those that didn't see it yesterday, about what your research is saying about the neural impacts on hitting?
Yeah, well, it's trying to catch up with the physical and physiological. I mean, the presentations yesterday, you mentioned Glenn's and Ryan's and Kristen's all have this tremendous technology to measure physiological and physical through motion capture and force plates, and there is this measurement capability out there to measure neural activity in real time, mostly objectively. I mean, it's you still have to interpret it, but it's looking at neural activity while you're in vivo and seeing if that relates with actual performance. So I adapted a pitching paradigm, created a pitching paradigm in our lab where we can have hitters view pitches, although computerized pitches, and measure their neural activity and see if that relates with their performance. So trying to get beyond, the retrospective, what were you thinking, what were you doing, kind of vagueness and somewhat unreliable data in relation to the mental approach, so to speak, and getting a more objective measure to try to bring the psychological and cognitive on par with what the other panelists are doing here with motion capture and force plates and things like that.
Do you feel this is an asymmetric advantage that a baseball team could take advantage of now, or is this something that we're going to see evolve over the next few years?
Well, the technology is there, and it is reliable and well-vetted technology. I mean, EEG is the same technology that EMG and EKG utilize. I think it could be taken advantage of now. I think it's hard because it's a very mysterious kind of gray area looking at mental, processes, and it's not so objective, right? It's not a true measure of strength or flexibility or range of motion, but it does inform makeup. It does inform concentration, focus, attention, all these kind of buzzwords, and so I think it could be another data set that teams and organizations or players could have available to them to understand how to maximize performance. It's another tool in the toolbox, so to speak. It could also, speaking of injury, your upcoming book and the focus of the panels, it could help give information to burnout and things like that. The daily grind of baseball is not paralleled in other professional sports where you have to be ready, and as I'm sure others can speak better to it than I can, fatigue leads to injury, fatigue leads to breakdowns of technique and breakdowns of form, and this might be a way to get at the mental fatigue in a more objective way versus players obviously not going to be quite so open and honest with burnout and things of that nature. It's another way to measure and get around the problem.
Yeah, agree. Dr. Nicholson, obviously, again, you had a great presentation yesterday talking about kinesiology and biomechanics. One of the issues that we have is we figured out a bunch of ways for hitters to simulate, whether that's simple batting practice, whether that's hitting off a machine, or even as Dr. Themanson alluded to, now we're seeing virtual reality and some other things. That doesn't exist for pitchers. Do you think that's a problem? And do you think that just the mere sample size of lab studies like yours is going to be an obstacle we can overcome, or just something we have to deal with?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, I think that part of the reason why those different opportunities don't exist for the pitchers is because you're dealing with different situations. Batting, obviously, it's an external, I don't know the right word, but the ball coming in, it's external, so you can do that in virtual reality. You can do it with a pitching machine, but pitching is all internal. It's all the pitcher controlling it. It's them doing the actions. So you could certainly create virtual reality hitters, but I don't know that there's much value in that. And so I think the way that we're approaching it now is kind of your best option. And I'm sorry, I forget what the second part of your question was.
Sample size issues, because we can't recreate that, because pitching is such a destructive activity, and because it is so hard, your lab isn't exactly portable. It's tough to get just the sheer numbers of pitchers through labs like yours. Is that just an obstacle we're going to have to deal with, or do you feel that that's something that'll break down over time?
Yeah, I think a little bit of both. I think it's partially just an obstacle that we're going to have to deal with, but then over time, more and more people will be able to access some of these labs, like mine and Dr. Fleisig's and some other ones that are popping up. Additionally, pitching is so individualized. I don't know how important having huge masses of numbers kind of is, other than making these initial connections and figuring out what's associated with the injuries and the performance. But when it comes down to the individual pitcher, everyone that comes through the lab is going to benefit, regardless of how many other people have been through the lab.
I should refer to you as Dr. Crotin, but I know
it's fine. Kristen is fine.
Chris, I didn't want to shortchange Ryan. You mentioned your background as a strength coach, and one of the issues that we've seen over and over is that siloing. You used a different term, that there's a lot of information that doesn't cross over from sports science to nutrition to the sports med staff. Do you feel that that's something that can break down, or is it something that we tend to be so protective of our little area, we tend to be very protective of jobs, that it's going to be difficult for either professional or elite level, high school, college level teams to break that down?
Yeah, I mean, the previous role I had with the Angels as director of performance integration, the first thing that I was focused on with a monitoring system is the communication. So when it goes to, player health and performance, there's always an observation. So between all of the groups, all these people, you have to put all the important features into a grinder to determine what are your key variables that impact performance and health across, whether it's availability, so pain and dysfunction, or readiness, looking at strength, speed, and power, or workload, or lifestyle factors, or process metrics, or biomechanics. You have to have, key data that everybody understands in some way. So there's an educational process, and that you can work together on something. People have to understand how they all fit into the piece of the puzzle and that they're interdependent. But once you identify your observation, then you need that communication strategy. That has to happen. That is so essential. And I spent a lot of time focusing on communication. And the most important thing, the barrier in professional baseball that might not be in college or high school, is time. You have a lot of players that you need to talk about, and you need to be able to control for time. So in the sports science realm, you have to identify players at risk. And unfortunately, those are the ones that you have to focus on most, and you have to focus on availability over performance. Players that you think could be hurt based on data. And then that communication has to be so strong that people know how to implement. And one of my key responsibilities was to case manage. This is what, let's say it's a pitching issue. This is what the pitching coaches want to see out of this player. This is what we're seeing in biomechanics. This is the athlete's anatomy, injury history, his strength, speed, and power issues. Dietitians, all these people have a place at the table. It has to be organized with a good communication strategy. And part of your strategy has to have an evaluation. So at the end, people have to be pretty humble and realize, what I suggested with this player, I'm not really seeing the effect. And it's been, 2 or 3 weeks. And we have to be able to talk to our players about how we can pivot. When we go to work with a player, we pigeonhole ourselves to say, this is what I believe, this is what I think we should do. And if it doesn't work out, we kind of have this sunk cost that we want to try to keep going with it because it's a suggestion. So the communication process that we're talking about is just internally with staff, but we have to have that with players as well. The players have to be informed, say, hey, we're not perfect. We're taking this information. This is what we're looking at. We got to make a change. And then I think you get a lot more buy-in. But communication is the key, and there may need to be a point person to handle the communication strategy for the organization. It might not happen so easily between groups.
Absolutely. Dr. Themanson, here's, I didn't catch yesterday where you talked about the actual methodology for your study, though you just mentioned EEG, and I know you mentioned it yesterday. You also mentioned that in relation to EKG and EMG. There's really no need, I hope, for full EKG in baseball, though we are seeing a lot of data from heart rate sensors like Zephyr. We're also seeing some wearables that are purporting to give us some of the same things as EMG, though those are still very early days. When you talk about EEG, are we at a point where we're going to be able to get that, in a real setting rather than a lab setting inside of the next year, 2 years, 3 years? Or is this something further down the road where, the next iteration of Rawlings helmet is going to have little sensors in it and an antenna?
There is wearable mobile EEG out there now. It's tremendously noisy. Just because EEG measures the brain's neural activity, but that neural activity is associated with everything, right? You move, you breathe, you sneeze, you cough, you do whatever, that will be reflected in the neural activity. So to get at, in my world, mental processes, the player still has to be relatively still. But there is mobile wearable technology out there that if for a hitter could be standing literally in a batter's box watching live pitches, which happens, in rehab, the famous case of Kyle Schwarber coming back for the 2016 World Series, viewing pitches as he's rehabbing his knee. So the technology is there now that a player could be wearing an EEG apparatus while viewing live pitches, maybe not taking swings and things like that. So that is there today, and it's done in sleep research. Wearables has been for decades now. So that is there, getting the clean signal, the valid, reliable signal to get at what you're trying to get at. Might still take some massaging, but that is there now. Like you mentioned with heart rate monitors and things like that, wearables, you could wear EEG sensors and collect data if you know what data you're looking for today.
Kristen, yesterday you talked about predicting fastball from biomechanics. For people that missed that, could you just briefly summarize that? And can you talk about how your lab, obviously the forefront of research on this, is taking a look at the fight for velocity versus the fight to prevent injuries? Are those two diametrically opposed things, or can we ever align those in terms of research?
Certainly. So the research presentation I gave yesterday, we used machine learning and regression models to essentially predict fastball velocity, but the goal wasn't to predict velocity. The goal was to see which mechanical variables were most influential to fastball velocity, with the goal of being able to then adjust those mechanical variables to help increase performance. And that was the second paper or research study that we kind of did in our lab, with the first one being which of those mechanical variables are associated with pitching arm stress. So that elbow varus torque and that shoulder distraction force. And so for us, I actually technically work for the hospital. And so injury prevention is a really main goal of ours. But nobody wants to make changes that will prevent their injury if it's also going to decrease their performance. Velocity is so prized, and they're scouting for it now. And everybody wants to get the high velocity, kind of regardless of what that means, especially once you get to this college level. They don't want to make big mechanic changes if that's going to affect their velocity. We are really trying to encourage and kind of nail down what might be this pitching efficiency, which I know Ryan kind of talked about in his presentation, but we're trying to get at what variables will help reduce that elbow varus torque and reduce that shoulder distraction force while still helping or increasing pitch velocity. And we have found, that there's some that only affect pitch velocity, and there's some that seem to only affect elbow varus torque and shoulder distraction force. And so hopefully we can, with more research and more longitudinal stuff, especially, kind of nail down what these safe, appropriate, but also performance enhancing mechanics might look like.
Leads me directly to the next question for Ryan, which was, in terms of efficiency, are we going to see a way for efficiency to meet up with that demand for more and more velocity?
Yeah, I think biomechanics in general needs to be simplified slightly. This is why I like this metric. And when I talked to Glenn Fleissig and his crew, and I said, I'd like to be able to help out in this research project, and they were busy, which was unbelievable. They said, you can take this over. And I had some help with Gene Brewer. We really want to be able to see, there are normative ranges in baseball. I've seen a lot of reports from a lot of different major league teams that looks at, scaling an athlete's movement into a certain range. But nobody has really used that type of metric to be a hinging metric to say that, okay, if this is the apex metric, then we have to look at these factors, just like what Kristen said. We have to identify these factors and know them that can adjust the biomechanical efficiency. And the other thing is, when we go to make mechanical changes with athletes, we need to be really strict about, hey, I'm going to reassess them. And what can happen is that we do a biomechanical evaluation. We then have in our mind some kind of roadmap, but then the follow-up comes very late. And, in effect, our changes may have driven up loads, how did that competitive balance go from from velocity to joint load. But I think that, you know, if we can focus on that particular measure, is going to be very helpful. And also other measures around that. How does the physical world, you know, how does the athlete jump? How much power can they produce in their lower bodies? What are their rotational speeds when they train with med balls? You know, looking at arm strength or pounds per miles per hour. Those kinds of things mixed in the measures, I think, are going to be so more impactful for biomechanics than looking at motion capture alone.
Let me take myself off mute before I ask a follow-up question.
Yeah.
With that, in terms of adding to load, are you speaking to the biomechanical changes or just the additional work that has to be done? And if it's the former, doesn't that, you know, kind of lead to the need for more monitoring, whether that's by a wearable, whether that's by cameras, or whether that's, you know, in a serious enough situation, not letting somebody out of the lab?
Yeah, well, they kind of are related, because if you're looking at load in isolation from a biomechanical sense and not a volume sense, it's like if we identify even in a bullpen, right? Bullpens are usually they're about 5 or 6 miles per hour down from the average game velocity. So if we're seeing the mechanical load, even at 5-10 pitches, however many are being evaluated, and we're seeing there's an increase of even 1%. Now we're talking about volume load. You're compounding that percent over a series of repetitions. And that, you know, that to me is, they're kind of related. And so, you know, I think the real world perspective is we do have to figure out what we can do in games. You know, we have to be able to take the translation of that data that we find in the bullpen and see what happens in games. I think the research, it's going to be tough, but we kind of have to find some happy medium between marker and markerless, because we have to see what's actually going on. I mean, there's studies that are published where people are hand digitizing the data in highly academic, reputable journals like the American Journal of Sports Medicine. And now we have this sophisticated technology that I believe is stronger than that we need to be able to make that connection, because you know, there's a difference of adrenaline, and we need to also, you know, this is kind of with Jason's area, there's a psychological principle of mechanical change. There's compensations that we have to see. Certain batters with certain pitchers throw slower to batters that are not in the meat of the order. You know, they pace themselves, starters. That happens. So we need to get to a game perspective, and I think that's going to be very helpful too, to really defining efficient mechanics. In the lab is different. There's no batter. Sometimes there's no catcher. So, you know, we got to get there, I think.
Kristen, you had a look on your face like you wanted to follow that up.
No, I mean, I just agree with everything that Ryan said. And, you know, I think that's also part of when I said longitudinal, like that data doesn't exist. All the data out there is people that come into the lab once and then they leave and they're gone. And so, you know, we don't even know what is causing the injuries. We're just assuming more elbow varus torque and more shoulder distraction force leads to injury, which, you know, that makes sense. And that's the best we can do. But reassessing longitudinally and getting people back in there and then figuring out how we can assess in games, I do think is a key to figuring out, you know, efficiency and avoiding injury while still maintaining performance.
Jason, Ryan brought up an interesting idea there, and that is whether the cognitive load is something that's both measurable, and in baseball, anything measurable becomes scoutable. Do you see that as a possibility?
I think people have tried to get at that in a number of ways for years by questionnaires and interviews and soft kind of science skills. I think it's a real thing. I mean, to Ryan's point, I think that, I mean, the daily mental grind is I don't know how you can quantify it. It's in professional sport, there is no other sport like it, where you have to play a game every day. Was it 30 days off in 6 months or something like that? I think there are ways to measure it, and people try to get at it. And I know clinicians and sports scientists are out there trying to get at cognitive load and wear and tear and mental fatigue. But it certainly translates to everything that people talk about with injury and mechanical breakdowns. It's the devil of science is there's so much data, but you don't know which variables to utilize. I mean, with the biomechanical markers and the presentations yesterday, these 16 variables, these were the 4 most important. So now we need longitudinal data on those 4. So we need more data, but we need to ignore other data. And it's you don't know, which tail to chase, so to speak. Sometimes there has to be a way to integrate it and monitor it. This mental side with even within a lineup within a game, as Ryan brought up, but then also this longitudinal data. You come to the Wake Forest lab and you get you fix this or you work on this. Does that change persist 6 months later, 3 months later? Does it persist in the middle of the season with fatigue? And I know that this has been researched through Olympic training facilities and things of that nature, with swimmers and the cycle of a season, so to speak. But it is you're adding more data to the mix, which is not an easy thing to distill or communicate.
To follow that up, one of the things that we've seen over the last probably 15 years is a much more emphasis on mental training and mental readiness in the military, especially among pilots. We've seen, especially among special forces operators, that they've adopted a lot of technology and a lot of tests that try to focus on some form of mental readiness, down to the point of giving a single score. Is there a reason you don't think sports has adopted that sort of measurement? And do you feel that there's a value to it at this stage?
I would think there's a value to it. I would think sports in a lot of ways is to Ryan's point, there are so many people, there are so many athletes that they're trying. I mean, there's only so much time in a day. If you have your minor league teams, baseball specifically, your minor league teams, your major league teams, you have tomorrow's starter, you have the immediacy of performance. Not only do you have to be ready, but you have to perform. And there's a difference of that. Readiness, a special forces operator could be ready, but not have to perform every day, like a firefighter or something. But as an athlete, every 5th day you're going to pitch, or tomorrow you're in the lineup again, tomorrow you're in the lineup again. So there's not enough downtime, in essence, for the bandwidth to get at these readiness metrics and implement them within a season. I know a lot can happen in an off season, but the focus seems to be more on the physical in the off season. You hear every year the player added 20 pounds of muscle mass, or player worked on this, or changed their mechanics and things like that to avoid injury, because there's this prima facie relationship between the physical and the injury, or the physical and performance. And it's much more opaque to look at the mental relationship with performance. But there is certainly room to borrow from other sports. Motion capture baseball borrowed from golf and took, was following, behind golf and a lot of those measures. And the mental side, certainly to your point, DARPA has funded a tremendous amount of research with special forces and military operations looking at mental readiness, focus, mental acumen, and things like that. So it is there in sport. It is hidden. There's been biofeedback training with marksmen in the Olympics for 20 or 30 years. To utilize EEG feedback to try to get themselves in a quiet, relaxed state. So it is there. It's just there's not as much time in the day with such a cumbersome season versus an Olympic training kind of ebb and flow of a season. I think
there's also a disconnect. You mentioned performance there, and it immediately brings to mind Mickey Mantle showing up hungover for a game and hitting 3 home runs. That disconnect between actual readiness and performance is often disguised.
Yeah, I mean, obviously talent and skill and capability play a role as well. I can be as ready as I want to be, and I'm never going to be able to perform the way some other people can perform. So there is that disconnect of what's the ceiling, like how if a player cannot throw a strike from 60 feet 6 inches, repeatedly, it doesn't matter how mentally ready they are, right? They're not going to do very much to help your team win and move forward. So there that, and I think that's why this side can be discounted, the mental side can be discounted in a lot of ways. But at the elite level, if people are already there physically, I think the readiness can discern and definitely play a role in separating top tier from top tier, you know, great from good or better from average. And I think, you know, especially at elite levels, that is an inefficiency you can exploit. But to your point, exactly, I can be as ready as I can be, and I will never be Mickey Mantle.
Yeah, same. Kristen, at both ends of your profession, we're about to see an explosion. There's more and more labs like yours. It used to be, it was Birmingham, and then California and Driveline, and then you guys came in, and now we're seeing Louisiana Tech, where Ryan's done some work, and who was it, Rice, that announced a pitching lab. We're seeing more and more of these, and there's more both inside and outside the game. On the other hand, we're also seeing an explosion of, I don't want to say lesser quality, but it is somewhat lesser quality in terms of video, whether that's Hawkeye, whether that's Kinetrax, whether that's ProPlay, where there's going to be more data available of a slightly lesser quality. How are you going to deal with those two extremes, and how do you see the profession adjusting to what should be a multiplication of data to analyze?
I mean, I only think it's going to benefit the sport to have more and more of these labs available. Like I said, the kind of the longitudinal information and actual like studies, like prospective studies, is where we're still really lacking. You know, a lot of the ASMI has also been retrospective stuff. They have all this data from years and years of providing pitching evaluations that they kind of look back on. They've done a few prospective things, but it's a lot of like looking at correlations and what's related and how you can alter things to reduce arm stress and things like that. But there isn't a lot of those prospective studies. You know, to Jason's point, we ask a grit and a mental toughness and a resiliency questionnaire, but when you just come in and get a biomechanical eval, you know, what's the point of that information? And so we need studies that then look at, well, are those related to whether or not they get injured? Can you do something to change them? Can you adjust it in the game and see a difference in their performance and in their mental toughness or in their grit? And so as more and more institutes open labs, hopefully some more of that prospective research can be done rather than just the kind of for service pitching evaluation type stuff. And then the markerless and the video-based technologies, I think, are extremely tremendous in getting at what we were talking about earlier about what's happening in the game, or the AI type stuff or the ProPlay stuff and the 2D video based stuff, you know, that's going to just open up more access to younger players, and maybe we can start to affect, you know, mechanics at a young age when they are still willing to change mechanics to reduce injury, but still, you know, help increase their performance. There needs to be some more validation. So as more and more people have more and more scientific labs, maybe we can, you know, validate or correlate some more of these, you know, lesser video-based systems, or even some of the other things that Ryan mentioned, just like jump height and, you know, your handheld dynamometer stuff, and how, you know, fast they run their 40. If you can correlate some of those things to the biomechanical 3D motion capture evals, you know, that stuff is accessible to these high schoolers and these youth players, and you can just, you know, only going to benefit the sport and helping to figure out really how we can reduce these injuries and keep people playing in the game longer.
Kristen, you keep leading me into my next question. Thank you. Ryan, obviously all this data is coming in. What's the data that you're seeing? Are there going to be ways for us to get away from the high-tech, difficult and expensive solutions that aren't available to lower levels or even smaller colleges? Are we going to get to a point where we're going to be able to discern, you know, again, I don't want to use lesser, but more simple measures. You talked about jump height or sprints. Are there things we know now that we can use rather than building $1 million lab? Is there something that you can tell a high schooler or a junior high schooler out there that they can do now?
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, I can't get into the stuff with the Angels, but part of my role was also scouting athletic development, athletic performance. And you can get a lot of information off simple field tests, you know, broad jump, reactive broad jumps, vertical jumps, triple broad jumps. You can see a lot of the contractile properties of athletes that relate to velocity. You know, one of the things that's also simple to look at is circumferences. I measured athletes' bodies, particularly pitchers, in centimeters at certain segments, and you know, growth rates in athletes. BMI, you could look at looking at lean body mass per unit of height squared. So you can see so many things that people can do with a scale, a bathroom scale, to identify future performance with an athlete. I'm not making this salesy about my company, but it's very simple to use our dynamometer that's research grade and incredibly cost effective. And I think this should be done in a scouting battery, is to look at, you know, the pounds per miles per hour.
Once again, I muted myself. Dr. Themanson, we'll jump over to you as Ryan's reconnecting. Same sort of question. You know, your research is obviously not going to be available to the average high school or youth athlete. Are there things that those athletes, or more likely the parents and coaches, can take from your research and apply now? It's contagious. I'm sorry.
I followed your lead. I appreciate it. I'm not the only one. Yeah. I said something tremendously poignant, and now it's lost in the ether. That's the ideal. Obviously, it would be, I think, you know, and I have a couple boys that have played baseball, and you hear about baseball, you know, being accessible and things like that. And to Ryan and Kristen's point, if you can get something that's accessible to the youth, I mean, from my research, it does relate with, you know, the kind of positive psychology, sports psychologist measures, where it's just, you know, being present, being where your feet are, all those kind of cliches that you hear about. But if you take them, really take them for what they actually mean and what they're worth, and where to direct your attention, how to direct your attention, how to control arousal anxiety within performance, that has been associated with better performance and better outcomes, better mental health, better self-esteem, all kinds of other measures that are both directly and indirectly related with outcomes. So it is there. This my research creates a more objective way to measure it. But yes, for people out there consuming baseball or playing baseball now, like literally just understanding what you can control, what you can't control, and working on being mindful of your emotions, your arousal, your stress, being open to coaching, as Dr. Nicholson mentioned. You know, you have college and professional players that now you're entrenched and you're set in your ways, and you're going to be resistant to change. Or the lab says, well, this could be tweaked, or this would improve your velocity, or improve your health, and improve your resilience to injury, and they will not, because they're already formed. That's a problem. So if you can get at it and just understand that you don't have all the answers, I mean, all this very cliche kind of stuff is actually real if you do implement it.
Absolutely. I'll close out my questions, and we'll take some time for your questions. Make sure you get those into the little Q&A button. I'll close out with you, Kristen. Same sort of question, a little twisted. A lot of people think a lab like yours is absolutely inaccessible to them, whether they're high school, showcase athlete. Do you see value for one of those athletes to come in and get an evaluation? How much does that cost, and how much would that help the research if we saw more of those kids?
Yeah, again, it's only going to help the research the more people that we can get. I know Coach Walter, the head baseball coach at Wake Forest, said that the lab isn't necessarily a money-making venture. The purpose is to help the sport of baseball and reduce these injuries. And so the more people that we get through, the more data we have available to look at these different connections and figure out what's going on and how we can reduce injuries and keep people in the game longer. And so there absolutely is benefit for people. Our youngest age limit is 12, so 12 and over to come into the lab. Most of the people that come through are high schoolers. We charge $350 for the assessment, but you get your full biomechanical evaluation. We do on-base movement screens. We do range of motion and strength with the handheld dynamometer. And then you get follow-up from our pitching lab coordinator, who tells you all the feedback from all three of those kind of portions, and then what you can do to change them and make some of these changes in your practice. So, I mean, I think it is incredibly valuable and frankly worth $350. I know a lot of sports science type stuff is a lot more expensive. So yeah, we welcome anybody that's interested to come get an eval.
Absolutely. We've got some great questions and we've still got time for everybody to get them in. Let's start with this one, and this one's open to the whole panel from Gabe. How do you think sports science findings with the advances in technology available to the pros can then be adapted to the youth baseball and coaching instruction?
I think we kind of touched on this already. I think what it needs to happen is, and it's not going to happen at the pro level, but at the college level and some of these other scientific labs, we need to make the connections and the correlations of how the 3D eval is then related to some of those more accessible technologies, whether it's 2D video or jump height or things that they do, sprint assessments, your handheld dynamometers, things like that.
Anybody else want to follow that one up?
Yeah, I think with the youth aspect of things, this is where you can utilize those, single camera technologies, or you can use sensor-based things. And if you see something that's really off, now you're looking for a lab, like Kristen's. You're looking to get something a little bit more detailed, to examine, what potential changes need to be fixed. A lot of the time too, I don't know if the labs are being marketed well to the youth athletes. They need to get into, a lot of outreach with coaches, and, maybe there's remote opportunities. And I just think that something is better than nothing with this process, in terms of getting youth athletes screened and evaluated and getting the right information.
Great one. I have a question from Joey. Have there been any studies that link physical development with psychological development? For example, what neural markers are associated with learning a new motor pattern? And do these change in different settings, practice versus training versus game? Sounds like that one's right up your alley, Jason.
No. Physical development doesn't align well with psychological development. Specifically, you can think about, especially females develop physically before males. Traditionally, I'm talking about biological sex, but then you have some males who go through puberty and are at their full height at 14 years old, 15 years old. Meanwhile, the brain doesn't finish myelinating, meaning becoming as efficient as it can be, until your early to mid 20s. So there's no relationship between physical maturation and psychological maturation. There are differences in neural markers with age. So children will show a different pattern of neural activity when solving a problem compared to young adults. So there's not really anything you can hang your hat on there about maturation being in line or using some marker that you got it. This motor learning, like the aha moment, there's no real neural marker for that. You can see measures of neural activity showing differences and seeing that you recognize a change or you recognize a difference, and maybe patterning changes a little bit, but there is no magic bullet with that, unfortunately.
Kristen, one of the things that we've seen is that the precise athletes that are being most scouted and most valued are the ones that are undergoing the most physical changes. Do you find that to be something of a dichotomy? I just saw a pitcher here locally who was touted to be a really good prospect as a high school sophomore, but he grew 6 inches and hasn't figured out where his arms are yet. Do you see that as a major problem?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the reason why our youngest age is 12. Prior to 12, the advice we're going to give all of them is get stronger and grow, and there's not really anything you can do. But to Jason's point, there's 12-year-olds who are 6'4" and 160 pounds or more than that, and then there's 12-year-olds who are not barely 5 feet and 100 pounds soaking wet. And so yeah, I mean, I think, and then it's crazy that kids are committing to colleges as freshmen when none of them are really at their true full maturation at 14 when they're committing to these schools, and who knows what's going to happen once they do hit that growth spurt and become more physically developed. And so the ones that hit it early, I think, do have a advantage over the ones that are still under 5 feet and have their baby fat still at 14. So I don't know what the solution to that is, other than a whole dynamic shift to recruiting later. But I don't know how to make that, if that'll ever happen. Yeah,
it's the little league conundrum. There's always that one 12-year-old with a better beard than I do. Mm-hmm. Let's jump into another question from Stephen. Pitching velocity is so prized, but the human body can only tolerate so much torque. Can the panelists envision a day when we literally have to cap miles per hour? This is Al Reddy's famous speed limit idea that anything over 100 miles an hour is a ball. Anybody think this is a cap, or do we just have to figure out efficiency, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, the world of baseball is so focused on velocity. I mean, I have some friends in the industry who train athletes, and they would rather go somewhere to use a weighted ball program than to actually do any kind of strength and conditioning for their bodies. It's so coveted in a sense that, you'll watch some of these training sessions and there's no targets. Just like what you're saying, that, if velocity without command, I don't think plays very well in later stages of baseball. I don't think there's a high predictive merit that if you throw really hard, you have no command and you don't have auxiliary pitches, that you're going to be successful. So I think, yes, we push the envelope for velocity and we want our athletes to throw harder, but there are physical costs. They're physical costs. Do we go in the future with our technology to scan ligaments? Does that become something that we look at, and now we put a governor on that kind of thing? It's possible. I mean, I think there's going to be more studies that look at the orthopedics, the development of the elbow in athletes. I know myself as an athlete at 11 years old, I could throw in the low 70s, and I almost had an avulsion fracture. The doctor actually told me that this part of your elbow, it doesn't fully mature in just regular people until 16 or 17 years old, and so I think it's possible in the future, we're pushing this envelope of velocity that we may have to get some kind of internal measure to indicate to an athlete, hey, if you're starting to go beyond this, you have abnormal changes in your ligament, you have widening of your growth plates, you have all of these things that may preclude you from actually succeeding as an athlete. But for right now, I think the emphasis is velocity, and sometimes without assessment, without strength assessment, without looking at weakness to the arm, all sorts of things that I think need to go into play there.
Can you follow that one up, Kristen? Because obviously, all the things that you can measure in there, I don't know if you guys are doing any sort of correlation with MRIs or even ultrasounds. I was talking to a doctor the other day that was talking about visualizing ACLs with what he calls a nanoscope. which is basically an arthroscope the size of that needle you got your COVID shot with. Are you doing any of that work, Kristen?
We aren't currently, but like I said, I actually work for the hospital and for orthopedics. So that is somewhere where we can expand in the future. We've kind of only been around for 3 years now, trying to figure out the best way to utilize what we have. But that is definitely a direction that I think that we can go and then we need to go. And, I saw this question and at first I was like, oh, thinking, college and professional level. And I was like, I don't think that's ever going to happen, like implementing a pitch velocity cap. And then it's probably more about efficiency and finding the right mechanics. And we have seen that there are people that throw at 80 with really high elbow varus torque and people who throw at 95 with lower elbow varus torque. So while pitch velocity is associated with the elbow torques, there are other mechanics that do influence it as well. But then when Ryan brought up, all the growth changes, then I started thinking, well, maybe it makes more sense at the younger ages, maybe implementing a pitch velocity cap in youth players, and focus more on developing command and skill and efficient, proper mechanics instead of pushing velocity at such a young age.
Great point. I think it was great that Ryan's doctor had followed Dr. Mike Marshall's research that long ago. Question from Adam, and this one's for Jason. Have you worked in baseball specifically to map stimuli to specific areas of the brain, like the main visual cortex? I think you covered this in your presentation.
A little bit. EEG technology can localize activity to the brain. That's the level of analysis with EEG. It's just a big bag of salt water and you can't really get much beyond that. You can do a little bit of source localization. Others have implemented fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, to look more at where things go. There is some research. There was a group, the DeServo group, about a decade ago now, did some research and looked at pitch perception processes. But the problem with fMRI and MRI and imaging technologies like that is they're not in real time. That you're subjected to the time limitations of blood flow throughout the brain. And so, you have 400 milliseconds as a hitter to look at a pitch and see a pitch from release to the catcher's mitt. So EEG is really the only way to kind of capture that fast, rapid reactionary process. So the benefit you get with timing, you get for a loss in terms of localization.
Makes sense. And the last question that we have time for today is from Woody. Does sports science conduct benefit cost analysis associated with expenditures aimed at injury reduction? Well, teams would actually have to spend on injury reduction to do that. Ryan, you've been inside. You want to take this one?
Yep. Yeah, it's interesting. Yes, we do. We look at the cost of certain injuries. Obviously, it differs by the athlete's contract in terms of sunk salaries. We looked at the cost of rehabilitation. How much is, a single, Tommy John surgery cost our organization, and, room and board and food and individualized attention. And it can be very hard to say, we might need to hire 2 or 3 more people to be able to give athletes more care. And that's another thing too. The biggest cost, I will tell you, that I think research needs to go to in baseball is repeat injuries. That kind of thing needs to be seen, because the previous injury does predict the future injury. And I think if there's an understanding of, how to improve the rehabilitation care, you might lessen much more of a financial burden in the future for your team.
Oh. We lost Ryan again. Unfortunately, we're out of time. So I want to thank everybody, Dr. Kristen Nicholson from the Wake Forest Pitching Lab, Ryan Crotin, Lost in the Ether, is from armcare.com, and Jason Themanson is doing great research at Illinois Wesleyan. Say hi to Jake from State Farm for us. And thanks to everybody at SABR. I want to thank them for giving me the opportunity to sit here and ask questions. And hopefully everybody enjoyed the panel as much as I did. Thanks a lot.
Will, thank you so much for moderating that great panel. Really great discussion topics, and ones that we're going to continue to revisit in future conferences.